I'm Sarah Marshall. I'm technology editor of journalism.co.uk. We're a site for journalists, all about innovative stuff. And that's how I got to know Dennis, because what Visual Revenue is doing is kind of one of those platforms that I kind of looked at the start, and it's doing some really interesting stuff. So I think, first of all, before I introduce you to the rest of the panel or let them introduce themselves, let's first hear a bit about what you've been doing. It's your presentation.
I think I might even have just a few slides. I won't bore you too long, but just add a little bit of commentary. So I think we can look at social in 100 different ways, but I certainly think there's two unique ways of looking at it. One, which is that of it not replacing the newsroom, but certainly assisting it in figure out whether you pick one story over another, whether you can go verify a story, whether you get input to what stories to go produce. And I think that's fantastic. And the value of that might even just be one of a cost saving. And I think anybody should try to figure out how to do that to the best of their ability. The other part is that of looking at social as a channel, which is that I produced a pool of content, whether I'm the Weather Channel or The Sun or The Independent or Forbes or anybody who's in the space of producing content, and I want to use that, or perhaps even just try to make the most of it, not to go benefit Twitter or Facebook or Pinterest, but to the benefits of myself. And that is certainly the angle that we've taken when we go speak to our clients. And I think it starts with this idea that if you, and we can take Forbes as an example here, who will produce 350 something original stories on a daily basis, or so has Lewis certainly proclaimed. And with that pool of content, they need to go figure out which ones they would push out to which social channels, and they need to do so on that exact day. And it's not one way you can really test so aggressively that come tomorrow, I will be a little bit wiser on what I should have done yesterday. You need to figure that out right now. But when you go do this, I think for us certainly, when we started attacking this specific channel, and the space that we've been in for years have been the space of helping editors figure out what content to go program on their homepages or section fronts, and have just recently, over the last half year, started to attack this channel, is the one of defining success and failure. Because I think it's very easy to fall in love with vanity metrics such as number of followers or fans or shares or retweets or favorites or any one of those kind of proxy metrics that might or might not mean anything. So we've taken the stance that if anything, or if I'm to help the publishers that we work with, the ultimate outcome really is to get somebody to fall in love with that one specific tweet, or that one specific share, so much that they actually click into the story and consume it in full. And if you're really successful, they like it to the extent where they're actually willing to go share it with their friends. But if I don't get people onto my site, I lose any opportunity to monetize this story at any extent. And if I can't get there, the other metrics don't really matter too much. And I think the way you can help publishers, and this has certainly been our approach, is in two ways. One is to create a space where you have a much better understanding of what you can do, and when you do something, what the expectations are. Because I think there's just a little bit of this fire and forget attitude sprayed upon the social channel, which is that I go push 50-something stories today, and one of them might actually just propel into a huge success, and the rest I somewhat forget about. What I'd rather see is some level of accountability, which is that I pushed 50 stories, 40 worked as expected, 5 just tanked, and is there anything which I can learn from those, and 5 actually propelled into some sort of success above and beyond what I had hoped for, and kind of try to repeat that tomorrow. And that's been our starting point. And right now, we do that for about 200-something tier 1 destinations, such as the beautiful people here. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to get the three of you to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll go into a Q&A, and at any point we'll leave time for questions, but you can also chip in if you want to during the Q&A between the five of us. Patrick.
So I'm Patrick Vogt. I actually lead the weather company, all the business outside the US. And what that entails is our television properties and all the content we're creating there. All of our digital properties, you know it as weather.com or Weather Underground. And all of our professional businesses. We have, when you're flying here today, or if you were on a plane and you hear the pilot get on and say there's weather coming up, we're feeding that forecast to these planes. We have a large, and then we're taking data back down and assembling that data and helps provide a better forecast. So I lead the business outside of the US, and how I ended up here was I spent most of my career in ad tech, running large ad tech companies, and then at Sony, Dell, and HP as an executive. I'm dating myself a little bit here in the mid 90s, really all around e-commerce and direct selling. So I've been in the tech space for some time and was seeing this evolution of big data and a lot of stuff happening on social in the collection of data. And when you look at the biggest and largest and most volatile data set that touches all these screens, weather, it influences our lives every single day and touches every business every single day.
A very British subject. So Jack,
Yes.
do you want to introduce yourself now?
Sure. So I'm Jack Riley. I'm the head of digital audience and content development for the Independent Evening Standard. That means I work between the product and the editorial teams to build new products, partner with technology companies like Visual Revenue, and do that to build new audiences and grow the audiences that we have at the moment, and particularly in the sort of social space. So.
My name's Derek Brown. I'm digital editor of The Sun, so ultimately I'm responsible for what we put on the homepage every day. I'm also responsible for the digital strategy of The Sun, where we're going forward with our tablet apps, our smartphone apps. Like everybody else who works on newspaper websites, trying to figure out if in 10 years' time we're going to be able to monetize this digital industry properly or not. I still don't have the answer to that one just yet, but yeah, so that's what I do.
Great. So just briefly, all of you, can you just tell me a little bit about who at your organisations are looking at the analytics? Is it just the homepage editor, or is it increasingly journalists having to kind of be aware of what's resonating?
So I'll start. We have multiple analysts. We have over 300 meteorologists. A lot of them are analysts in building the core data set and analyzing and forecasting the weather. So we have partnerships with a lot of Met offices around the world. So that's the first layer of analysts we have. Then we have, across those businesses, we have media folks who are analyzing how that weather data is impacting brands. For example, we have intelligent media programs where if it's certain degrees, it might trigger a different creative. And if it's below those, it'll trigger something for Quaker. We were just running here in the UK, where if it was above a certain degrees, it triggered a creative with a forward message around Quaker. And then if it was cold enough, it was go get Quaker now and have it for breakfast. So there's weather intelligence built into everything we do, and we have analysts all over the country, probably over 100 of them.
So who's checking at the Independent, Jack?
Me, all the time, and pretty much everyone, right down from from senior management to the digital newsroom now. I think a big change that I've definitely observed in the industry and microcosmically at the Independent and the Evening Standard is this general move towards great exposure to these analytics now, and it's become such that there's a language is developed around it in the newsroom that people will understand. If you say, "Oh, good day yesterday, 3.5," they'll know that's 3.5 million global page views. So we've tried to kind of run that all the way through through the editorial team, and particularly some of the analytics tools which allow you to actually take action within the platform mean that that's not just a kind of an observational task. It's actually a task where you can use the data right there in the platforms that it's provided to you.
Similar to Jack, I mean, my vision is I want to get everybody at The Sun, every single journalist at The Sun, completely aware of every single statistic that happens, because You know, I worked on the newspaper for the best part of 10 years, the Sun newspaper, and you're kind of you don't realize until you move into digital how much in the dark you are. You know how many newspapers you sell every day. You think the reader is quite like the page 3 lead or the Mystic Meg that particular day, or that particular Dear Deirdre problem is better than that one. You don't. It's not an exact science. So since I've moved into digital, I've been kind of blown away by the depth of statistics you can get and the freedom and the agility with which you can move things around and change. So what I've tried to do is I've started with the digital team, and we put out bulletins every morning saying what stories have done well, what stories haven't done well. We have competitions where we try and get people to come up with their own stuff and get as much traffic as they can for it. That was an idea from Gawker. Again, we can track how well people do over 24 hours. And the biggest challenge for me is engaging the old part of the media with what works really well online. It's a slightly different audience, which we've got to take with a pinch of salt, but it's really helped the newspaper in the last sort of 6 months to a year, presenting to them every day the stories that have performed well throughout the day, at what time they've performed well, and particularly to Dennis's point, which stories have been shared a lot, which have been part of that kind of national conversation. So I brought a little prop along with me, but this seems quite old school doing this, but one of the most engaging things we managed to do in the last year, at Christmas I decided to make like a magazine which breaks down every statistic of the Sun website over the last year. We called it Traffic, and it was from the most byline journalists of last year to the most commented stories, to we even did the biggest features, the most followed journalists on Twitter. Breasts do quite well on the Sun website, so we did the best. But and that really engaged, and it was amazing the effect, just showing journalists how their stories perform and how they performed and how well read they were and how well commented. It's amazing the transformation that can have on a journalist.
Let's talk a little bit about what Dennis was talking about. So one of the things that visual revenue does, it's all about predictive analytics. So it can tell you where on a page to put stuff. And I think, Derek, you've got a good example of whether when editors have either followed advice from visual revenue, or maybe they've ignored the advice and just gone with their editorial judgment.
Yeah, so we use visual revenue, and we started using it about 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, something like that. And it's a really valuable tool. But the one thing that I've always said to Dennis, because he comes in and speaks to us from time to time, is that you kind of have to ignore it sometimes. Great example last week, new Pope. Visual revenue is telling us, screaming at us, nobody is interested in this story. We're far more interested in the Katy Perry story. Put that above the Pope. Put the Pope way down the bottom of your homepage. Nobody really wants to read it on your website. And of course, at that point, and there's lots of examples of that every day of the week, where you just have to, the human being has to intervene and say, okay, they may be more interested in Katy Perry in a bikini today, however, the Pope is a far more important story. Yesterday, another example came up with the budget. I don't think the budget even ended up in our top 10 stories of the day on our website, which probably isn't a surprise to many people, because that is a story that people will generally go to the BBC website for, Guardian website, Telegraph website. However, it's a very important story, and it's very important that we give it great prominence on our website. Visual revenue was telling us to put it nowhere near the top of our website. Sorry about that, Dennis, by the way.
No. Not offended at all. I think first of all, I'm just a little bit afraid of Derek, so I'll keep it short. But that said, I think there's this idea that if we or anybody else, whether that be a colleague of yours, comes up with a recommendation, that you must take it. And I think that's somewhat naive. So if Susan, your colleague, walks up to you 50 times a day, provides you a recommendation, you take all of them, what is your job? I actually think your job is to say no thank you, or fuck off, as they so politely said when we sat inside the New York Daily News for a year. And I think that is the beauty of the system, which is that it's not something where you would allow a machine to dictate what you put on the agenda, but I do think that you can use data to figure out how far you're willing to take that story on the Pope, and you might have taken it 7 hours in, where this time you might cut it just a little bit shorter, or just stick with it, but at least know the cost of that, and how many of those investments can I allow myself to do throughout the week, which is, and I think that's another good example, the New York Daily News, which is kind of the Sun in New York, will once every 3 weeks figure out that they should go promote what's happening in the Middle East, and I certainly believe myself it's important But if I want to read about the Middle East, I probably read the New York Times. But they'll have that moment, and they'll go promote that. But it's with the understanding that there's a cost associated with it. And I'm making an investment right now, not in lost page views, but in the willingness of the reader to come back tomorrow. And if I keep, I wouldn't say disappointing him, but presenting him in content that is not to his liking, one day, he'll stop. So you can only do it so many times. But I think, Derek's finest job is to say, no, thank you.
It's absolutely true, and coming back to that point, visual revenue has flagged up stories to me which I would never in a million years would have thought would have performed well on our website, and said, and screamed out to me at points to say, this little story that you've got at the bottom of the Scottish homepage is doing really well. It's being shared on Facebook, it's getting lots of traffic. We suggest you move that a bit higher up. And that's where it is worth its weight.
Which is obviously the reverse scenario. One thing is to kind of get punched in the face and say, take the Pope down, which is kind of a negative connotation. I think the more interesting one is we got a story outside of your top 20, which somewhat disappeared for some reason, that if you were just willing to give it a little bit more exposure, that could end up being, the story of the day, whether that be from a viewpoint, a share point, and I think that's interesting, and that has a positive connotation to it.
So is this working in tandem between the editor's decision and what the data is saying? And Jack, I know one of the features of visual revenue that they released maybe a year ago is something called, less than that, headline testing. So what they do, they give publishers the opportunity to put 2 headlines out for the same story. So on half of the country, I don't know whether it's a geographical split, may get 1 headline, the other half of the country gets the other headline, and then they run with whichever's resonating the most. Yep. You're using it, right?
Yeah, we do. We do use the platform for that specific purpose. At the moment, we're using that on the Evening Standard and the sport landing page on the Independent. I think it's I think a lot of this discussion is about front pages, and actually, social. A big part of social is actually linked to the waning importance of the front page, and the fact that actually, your newspaper isn't the front page anymore. Google News or Twitter or Facebook might be the front page. But I think that there's, the way that we've used these analytics and the headline testing is a good example of this. Is we think of the content that's on the front page as a sort of a sample of what we've got, and the sort of the most. It's the area of the product that's got the most editorial oversight. So it's the area where we've got the most opportunity to optimize exactly what we're doing. When we do things like the headline testing to see which headlines actually have the highest CTR, and it is remarkable. You can see that very similar stories can actually have widely differing performance based on those headlines. When we do that, we then feed those headlines back into our publishing system, but we also take all of the CTR optimized assets that the front page, the top stories, and the other blocks on there, and we drop those down onto the article page level as well. So I think one of the key things is the front page is now it's a concept rather than an actual physical page. You take that concept of your most engaging, eye-grabbing content, which is exactly what it was, before digital, and you then use that everywhere that you can, including then tweeting maybe the optimized headline rather than the original one.
Let's come on to talk specifically about social, and I know that I'm wondering whether your views are always all the same on this, about what the real kind of goal of social is, whether it is about a million different things or whether it's about, in the end, getting the financial return. I think I read recently that you kind of said retweets have no value, Dennis, or what do you think that?
I certainly had perhaps an off day that day, but I went on a rant just because some days I feel a little bit sad. Because I can remember 6 years ago, we sat in a similar panel and talked about, or perhaps even bitched about, how Google, in essence, were better at monetizing the content that you guys have produced, way better than you were. And then, we blinked, 6 years passed, and now we're somewhat kind of prostituting our content all over again just to Facebook and Twitter. And we just escaped Google. So it hurts a little bit when I see some people try to chase really to the value of Twitter and Facebook and others, retweets, shares, and favorites, and what have you, where personally, as I see it, the ultimate goal is, I want somebody to go back to the Sun or the Independent. Once they arrive there, I think we've been successful. And that kind of in between, I think those are good proxies for future value. And if you have a plan and a strategy in place, then I certainly think they hold value. But even if those retweets, if they don't end up in having other people being enticed to the extent that they come back, I just find it very difficult to see that anything but a set of vanity metrics. And that's something I do because I love my customers, not because I'm bitter.
Do any of you disagree?
We come from a different point with our business, but overall, I think everything we're talking about here is data, analyzing that data and leveraging it for your respective businesses. From our perspective, we view social, mobile, and any kind of alerting communication as communication that can save lives. And when you look at Superstorm Sandy, that was a global story. Actually, half of our YouTube streaming from our channel in the US and channels out all over the world were outside of the US. It was not just a US story. And when you look at Facebook, volume in 2012, it was the #2 story. Just the Super Bowl was bigger with the Giants and the Patriots in it. So we look at social in a number of ways as how we can help save lives in alerting. And one of the things we've just done is we're trying to also, with our science and weather, from a media perspective, is really address these channels proactively. So there's a little, you might have read about it, we first went to the National Weather Service in the US, which is a consortium that names hurricanes. So all the government Met offices decide on what the names are in the year, and then the hurricanes are named globally. And we thought winter storms have the same impact. They're a little bit tougher to predict. They're not as formed storms, so they're harder to predict. But we said, we got to name them, and we went to the National Weather Service, and they said, no, we're going to pass. We don't think we should name them. So we just started naming them. And the reason why we're naming them is because #Nemo, which was one of the recent winter storms, allowed consumers to go to one spot and see all that alerting that was going on, and it helped save lives. It helped people get out of the way where that storm was going to be hitting. So that's the way we look at social, very much like an alerting platform, but we view it just like we do the web, TV, any screen, and how we leverage it across all of our content.
Do either of you want to say what social is for you? Is it you saving lives, or is it vanity? Or?
Excuse me, no, I'm afraid no, we're not saving lives, I don't think. I think, to the question of whether we're sort of ceding too much control to social networks, I think, ultimately this all just comes back to the user, and that's where the users are, and to try and ignore it or to even fight it actually is actually it's the wrong analogy, but it's King Canute arguing with the tide, as he actually didn't. So I think we've got to work with these companies who are now the gatekeepers to our audience, and actually it's easy to lock yourself out of that conversation and either use the minimal amount of the tools or not engage with it. What we've found with, particularly with the Independent and with the partnership with Facebook that we did on our Open Graph app, for example, is that actually working with these companies, and particularly Facebook, there's a tremendous opportunity there to play a part in shaping the media consumption of a new generation of newsreaders and of a new audience. And we've seen a tremendous kind of success from that. So a good example is our Open Graph app, which has about just over 5.5 million installations now, and about 50% of that audience is 25 or under, which for what would classically be referred to as a broadsheet newspaper, that's a really important new audience for us to work with. It's also enabled us to build lots of tools to allow people to express themselves and their opinions to each other in really interesting ways, and ways that have the potential to drive a huge amount of traffic back to the site. So in particular, when we launched Independent Voices, which is a sort of a new comment vertical that we've launched as part of independent.co.uk, we built in open graph actions that would allow people to agree or disagree with articles in a way that was kind of seamlessly shared back to their friends. And we found that's been really popular, and that those stories have a really high CTR on Facebook because people are really interested in actually their friends' take on the news. They want content through the lens of of the people who mean something to them in their lives. So yeah, I think you can't fight it. We've all just got to go with it and try and find our way.
And just on that, then, if your large Facebook audience is then logging into Independent Voices and commenting, you kind of know who these people are, whereas before you maybe had no idea who the readers are. Because this session is looking at the profitability, how do you then, does that influence how you can make money out of them, or what messages you
I
take?
mean, it feeds into just a general better understanding of your audience, and that's it's something that digital newspapers in the strict kind of search and direct era probably didn't grapple with hard enough. I think a big focus of a lot of publishers nowadays is your registration experience and how much data you can collect and how you can then leverage that with in terms of what it says about you to your advertisers and the brands that you might kind of approach to try and sort of forge some kind of relationship. So we're in an interesting position because we have these this huge audience of installed users of the Facebook app, and we also now have a great registration platform that allows people to use a lot of new engagement tools, so things like debate comments, so commenting on either side of a debate or reacting to an article, so rather than leaving a comment saying that you agree or disagree with a button press. Those tools mean that there's a great incentive for users to sign in, and and we hope that because we're a trusted publisher and we use that data very responsibly, that can be something that's valuable to us and to the audience as well.
For The Sun, I guess social for The Sun means Facebook.
Yeah,
Does
we have a very, very big Facebook audience. We've over 1 million. I kind of agree with Dennis here a little bit, but I'm guilty of pandering to Facebook as well. So when I started as digital editor, my first goal was we had 6,000 Facebook likes on our page. We've now got, on our core page, we've got nearly 700,000. And across our Facebook pages, we have over 1 million. I'm not sure why we do it. If people ask me, how would you get out of it? Because like Dennis pointed out there, I look at the statistics. We post 3 or 4 stories a day on Facebook and generally ask people's opinion. What do you think of this? When I look at the click-through rate on those posts on Facebook to the actual website, it's really small. I mean, it's a tiny percentage. So people are forming an opinion, they're reading the little blurb that we put up there, they're forming an opinion, they're leaving a comment. What I like about Facebook is that we can get up to 1,000 comments on a Facebook post, which is far outweighs what we would get on the story on the website. So I quite like the fact that we are, for that moment in time, the centre of a large conversation with lots of people talking to each other. I'm not sure what the monetary value of that is, but we live in a world in kind of newspaper journalism at the moment where I'm not convinced that anybody really knows what they're doing, okay? I haven't seen anybody in the digital newspaper era from a business point of view. We have fabulous websites. The Guardian website's great. The Mail Online's great. I personally like our website. We have great websites. From a business point of view, I'm not sure anybody really knows what they're doing yet. We may well look at what we're doing in 10 years' time, and we may well agree with it. We might say, what were we doing putting all our stuff on Facebook? Were we mad? We might say, what were we doing desperately chasing traffic on our websites and just giving everything away for free? So the monetization argument is very difficult. From where I'm sitting, the only newspaper in Britain who are making a real fist of monetizing their web content is The Times at the moment. The Telegraph are having a few rumblings around it. So it's a tricky one, Facebook. I crave, like with traffic, I crave traffic and I crave Facebook likes, but I'm not quite sure why from a kind of business point of view.
So in terms of thinking about when stories are being shared, or when people, I mean, as a journalist, or certainly as editorial people, we're just kind of probably plugged in for most of the day, but we forget that actually most of the population comes to Facebook at lunchtime or after work. How do you therefore get your stories in front of those eyeballs? So if something's broken in the morning, how do you then do you retweet, or do you time your story specifically to go out on Facebook at particular times? This is social media optimization, SMO. And I know that within the new social offering, the new social channel you're doing, it's very much about recommending when editors should be pushing out their content. I don't know whether you wanted to say anything else before we heard some examples.
So just like Derek choose to go promote that story on the Pope, and by promote, he means probably in the carousel 1, 2, 3, or 4, because you think or know for sure that that's the most prominent space on the sun.co.uk. I think a lot of people don't necessarily have before they have any data on it. It's any idea of when is the most impactful time I can go push something onto Facebook or onto, say, Twitter or another social channel. And unless it's breaking news where it needs to go out right now, sometimes there's a whole lot more value in keeping a story back just 45 minutes and pushing just a little bit later, because then everybody else have arrived at that point in view. And if I go look at The Atlantic or Slate or other of our customers with a massive following, we're not talking about 5-10%, but 100% difference happening over just 1 hour. So if you come just a little bit too early, that story just dies. You might as well not have pushed it, but if you were willing to wait, and it's a feature story that doesn't have to go out now, you need a good understanding of when do I push that. That's the one part. Then I think the other part is a good understanding of the river in which you participate. Because even though there might just be more people in at one, if the type of content which you produce is in a river so fast that you might actually just be better off just waiting a little bit where there's less competition, you might again just end up a little bit better. And then finally, one of the metrics that we look at is the actual decay again in the type of content you produce, where USA Today Sports or Sports Illustrated will have content where the decay is extremely rapid, meaning right after the game, I lost all interest. It doesn't mean anything. I've been told 800 times over on Facebook who won, so you can't tell me again. And I think a good understanding of just some of those metrics, which we then combine, and that might sound as aggressive as before, into a set of recommendations on, I suggest you take this story on the banking crisis in Spain, which you wrote 20 minutes ago and put out on Twitter in about 2 hours and 40 minutes. And you know what? Derek might not like that, and just leave it. It was a suggestion, or it might just be a good fit, and he'll take it or be inspired by it.
I think a big part of this is also categorical, and naturally for our business, it's all about weather. So we're the fast river every day, hyper-local. When you power up your weather channel app on your iPhone or your Droid phone, or you go to Facebook, or we're tweeting about the weather, it needs to be accurate, real time. So we're taking this massive data set, and that's the first part of our content waterfall, is getting live weather to all of our 100 million plus downloads of our mobile app every day, and our websites and our television properties. Then the next level of our waterfall is, as being journalists, is looking at where severe weather's happening all over the world. And severe weather events with what's happening with climate change are growing. It's a great time to be in weather. We don't wish for it, but we know how to monetize severe weather events very, very well. But we also save lives while we're doing that. And that is really at a hyper-local level telling that severe weather story. But then we use social and some of the mobile feedback we get and the alerting technologies that we have and how we integrate social onto our owned and operated properties to have thematic areas of long-form content. Some of that long-form content drives the ice pilots type show that you might see on our television properties, or it might drive a long-form piece of content. Some of it drives frizzy hair days or pollen counts all over. So we have this waterfall of content that's very sophisticated, using social to help us predict what users may want when it's a nice sunny day out in any area of the world.
So either Jack or Derek, do you just put stuff out when it happens, when there's an event, or do you think a little bit more, particularly maybe around Facebook or even Twitter, about when you're reaching your audience, when you're posting stories?
We're a bit more scientific about Twitter. So we treat, I think like most news agencies, we treat Twitter and Facebook very differently. We use Twitter as breaking news. Something happens, we tweet it straight away just to alert people to the fact. What you end up as a Twitter user, anybody who uses Twitter will be all too familiar with this, you end up with 10 tweets about the same event, all coming in around about the same time. Facebook, we don't treat as a breaking news service at all. We treat it as as I said before, a conversation starter, something that some people can have an opinion about. We also use it as a tool to sort of cheer people up sometimes at the end of the day by posting a funny video that people can watch from their Facebook pages. But so with Facebook, there's no great science around Facebook. There are better times than others, but we tend to aim for first thing in the morning, lunchtime, and early evening when people may be logging into the PCs at home and checking their Facebook feed. Sometimes we're more successful than others. At the end of the day, it depends on when human beings are sat at their computer or checking their phones. With Twitter, we tweet just every story we publish. So that's a constant throughout the day process.
Jack?
Yeah, I think particularly with Facebook, we're finding recently that we've played with the timing a little bit. We're finding really high engagement with posts that we put out overnight, actually, kind of catering to that sort of user experience of that I think is very, very common nowadays, of people waking up and the very first thing they might do will be to check Facebook. And if you've been there overnight or very early in the morning, actually, your story might have built a critical kind of mass of likes to appear in the news feed. So that's something that we found very fruitful. Otherwise, I think it's quite a similar philosophy. Twitter is a very different service. And with Facebook, I think this also comes back to some of the sort of live questions at the moment about the change in the Facebook newsfeed, because obviously the Facebook experience is sort of changing going to change quite drastically. In the new design, I think there's much bigger images. There are far fewer items, and actually, maybe this will kind of allay some of your concerns about giving away the content on the page. I think there's a big focus on page likes, and pages with a lot of likes, I think, are performing a lot better. So maybe it's between platform and pages. I think the balance is moving maybe slightly back towards pages. But really, all of our publishing power, even collectively, amongst publishers, is dwarfed by that of our audience, and really the big distribution of your content is going to be dictated by by them. And for that, we tend to see a peak of 1 p.m. for Facebook, as you described, and kind of lunchtime peak, and of 9 a.m. actually for Twitter. We see a lot of Twitter traffic early in the morning. So.
Great. Let's take some questions. I've got plenty more questions, but let's take a few questions from you lot. So just raise your hand, and I will try and. There's one over there. I can see two over there. Just introduce yourself first.
I'm Caroline Ray, and I work for UKTV. I just sort of wondered whether or not this kind of social data and analytics will ever eventually lead to kind of consumers having maybe their own personalised sort of front page, and if that will kind of remove what we were talking about earlier with the Pope story, that kind of editorial decision and final say over it.
Who would like to take that?
I think absolutely. I mean, I don't know if anybody's familiar with an aggregator called Prismatic.com. If you haven't used it, I really recommend it. I don't work for them or anything like that. I don't have shares in it, but it's a great example of how personalisation really works for me. It only serves me stories that I want. It's an endless scroll of stories, and it learns. The more I click on it, the more that I'm doing. And we're looking within our technology department at the Sun as to how far we can go with personalisation. I think the one thing about personalisation, though, there is. It's one of those things where there still needs to be human intervention. I want a bit of personalisation, but I want someone to introduce something to me that blindsides me a little bit, that I never would have discovered had it just been stuff being served that I like. So that there's a balance, I think, to be had. I'm really excited about the potential of personalisation, though, and I would love it if every reader who came to the sun.co.uk was served with a different homepage. So my homepage was different to yours, and that would be brilliant. I think there's a lot of scope for that.
Yeah, I would say it's happening already, and I think it'll continue to progress. The issue with it right now is how complex the profile data is, and how much profile data, and consumers having the time to fill it out. Yahoo's been trying to do it with My Yahoo for years now. I think it really looks at vertical content. So I'll use weather as an example. In weather, it's easier because folks are checking it every day, and they're filling out their profile, and we can serve the type of weather data that they want every day to them. So we have a massive amount of profile data on our mobile devices, on our websites that are happening. We even have weather geeks that are buying personal weather stations, creating like a Facebook-type profile stage and measuring the weather right in their backyard. They're paying $2,000 for these devices. We've got around 1,500 of them in the UK. Feeding us data every day, and then they're writing. So.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, definitely. I think it's pretty much kind of already happening. If you if you look at aggregators, you look at the Google News experience, for example, they're really making an effort now, I think, to include local personalisation as well as topics. I think maybe one of my favourite products in this area was originally launched as Trove and now is socialmedia.com, which is the Washington Post sort of effort, and we did a really good job of actually bridging this gap that we've described from taking your Facebook experience and all of the content providers that you're interested in and bringing that content to you. But yeah, I also agree that it's important that we surprise people and that we keep something of a voice and an ability to inject something that people weren't expecting to be interested in into that equation. So I think all of these products have got to get that balance right.
And it's worth mentioning that Flipboard are speaking later, I believe, looking at the programme, but I think you were going to...
And I think it's important, and it's funny how I should be the advocate, right? It should be the other way around, that I should be sitting here defending personalization. But if you think about it just as a thought experiment, full-on personalization, meaning I go to the New York Times and they read my profile and it'll be 90% tech because I'm a propeller head. That's actually not why I go there. Or if I write the Economist.co.uk or the Atlantic, I actually go to those destinations because I like that brand and what it stands for, and I expect them to tell me a set of stories. It would be lovely, though, if they could sort out a pool of content which I would never click into. But I actually want their view of the world. I want to figure out whether the Middle East is on fire. That's what the New York Times is supposed to tell me. If I write The Sun or the New York Daily News or Forbes, I have other expectations. So I certainly believe in personalization, but I also believe in the idea that there's a certain value in a brand, and I can fall in love with that, and I want them to tell me a story.
Yeah, I think the issue you run into it sometimes is also, take Google and search. So if Google was, and they were trying to do it, and there was a lot of articles written about this probably around a year ago around, if I typed in a word, if I typed in autos, and one of the panelists here typed in autos and it was personalized, shouldn't we be getting the same organic search results if you're really trying to search for something in the World Wide Web, across the World Wide Web? And the answer was, you could end up with just searching only within the parameters there, and it could be getting back to what Google's mission was, to get you all the information that's available out there, to only giving you a slither of the information. And if you look at how the web started, it started with portals. I date myself here again with Yahoo, and everyone wanted to keep you on their sites, and you were only getting to 15% of the web content in the late 90s. And then when search came out, you got to 85% of the web content. So in some areas, I think personalization is really important, especially for news publications, even weather. But in areas like search, where it should be more democratized and there should be consistency, I don't think it works so well.
There's actually a great book out there. You should take a note if you haven't read it. It's called The Filter Bubble, which describes this idea and this experiment they ran on Facebook in the US, where you create this bubble and you end up getting a smaller and smaller set of information. That did this on political content, and if you're a Democrat, you ended up getting served just that because you ended up being over-personalized, and you couldn't really kind of break out of that bubble. It's an easy read, a great book. And I'm not on commission to say that.
Any other questions? Yes, over.
Hi, Zoe Clapp, also from UK TV. I was interested in what you were saying about your headline analytics, and I just wondered if you, maybe Derek or Jack, had examples of when you had tested out headlines and that process, and what those headlines were. I'm quite interested in some specifics.
While I think I can give you one specific data point, I can't reveal any of their data points. We did one with USA Today. They allowed us to kind of share the data. They changed one word. It was during the London Olympics. They did 150-something tests during the London Olympics, had a 57% lift on average. But there's one that did about 194%, which was Michael Phelps not doing well. They originally wrote sluggish, turned it into something more in line with what I'm sure Derek would have written to begin with, which was crappy. So one word just changed, and that increased the traffic twofold to the same story in the same position with the same audience, just being a little bit more snarky. And I think that's fascinating, and that's not me suggesting that you should be more snarky, just saying that it's actually really small changes that will make really dramatic impacts. And we see weather is really aggressive, certainly the guys that we work with in the US, hundreds of tests. And I know because I sat there the day of Sandy, and they really made sure that the stories that they wanted to communicate were in line with what the audience expected.
Do any of the other people have examples, Jack?
Well, whenever I've tried it, I've found it very hard to write a headline that does any better than the original one, but that's probably more a comment on me than the platform. The editorial teams are really, really good at it, and what they've found, I think actually one of the things that's come up a few times since we started using this is actually making headlines a lot shorter, and maybe that's a kind of a sort of a piece of kind of vestigial broadsheet pompousness, that's pomposity rather, that's in there, that actually we're finding trim it down as much as you can, and that seems to make a difference. I think there's kind of a tactics and a strategy to it. So the tactics are, we're learning on a case by case basis what works better. Overall, we'll then feed that back into the homepage editing process and say, what we found this works really well. So so we're still testing.
And I'm guessing that headlines as well are, you might write a different headline for social, or one headline might work well on social, a different headline might work well on search, a different headline for the front page.
That's
so I don't know whether
that's absolutely right, and I think that's a big, that's a big emerging trend, is actually writing. You'll have your kind of, in your page terms, you'll have your open graph title, you have your meta title, and you'll have your, your actual kind of H1 and what that actually looks like on the page. And they are very different. Search, you've got to get everything out there. You've got to get yourself, embedded in as many, search engine results as you can. So you really expose as much as as much as you can. Social is much more like the traditional sort of front page role of optimizing for CTR, and not necessarily, you don't have to give everything away, because if you're going to find commercial value in these platforms, it's in the traffic that you drive back to your sites again. So those headlines can't be too descriptive, perhaps.
The US weather folks actually did something which I thought was super smart, which I recommend to everybody else. So they run so many tests that once in a while, and I'm not even sure they have a schedule for it, but once in a while, whether that's once a month, every 2 months, they actually download all of the headline tests that they've run and actually go through those and look at winners and losers and try to learn something from this, which they can use. So come next month, my original A headline is just a little bit stronger. We've seen the same with the Gannett, but that's not really just on a monthly by month basis. They give it to new editors, as in, if you're in doubt, this is what I want you to do. I can punch you in the face, 3 months straight, or you can read this. Those are the two options.
I think we have a very sophisticated waterfall around content and how we test different things, and actually all of those headlines go into a neural network. Ironically, when you have a big storm like Sandy, we get a lot of data, but it's not as important. It's when we have to monetize the local storms to get folks' attention, where it may not be as important to them. They may not think they're in harm's way, where that data becomes more important to get the story out there. But as a journalistic organization, we also have to be very careful on how we're a science and data company. So we're really providing a public service in a lot of what we're doing around severe weather. And we can sometimes be blamed as trying to take advantage of it, because we're a for-profit entity owned by private equity, trying to monetize it. So that naming thing around #Nemo and some of the headlines, we really look at it on how it's going to impact, and should we be that aggressive? And Sandy was the perfect example. Our model said it was going to go up the coast and make a left-hand turn and hover. So did the UK Met Office model, which we have a partnership with them. But the US National Weather Service model went out and said it was going to go like every other hurricane, up the coast and then out to sea. And how you tell that story when you're disagreeing with the National Weather Service is very sensitive. And there were some headlines that we were going to be using that were more aggressive and less aggressive. And we ended up deciding to lead with our on-air personalities to be more aggressive. And then what they were saying on air into our analytics tools were driving how we were representing it online and in mobile.
And I noticed when I came across your stand earlier, so you do this kind of headline testing. I see you're now doing picture testing.
So we have,
you're about to launch it?
This week, actually, we've been running for the last 2 months. So we have this idea that when you don't like the recommendation which we make, that must conclude that you like the call which you made to begin with, but if it's not working, it's just not working. So it's now your job to stand up and defend that story, and I think you can defend that story in multiple ways, certainly not just by sitting back and hope for the best, but I think you can go work the headline, or the image, or the abstracts, or just in general how you promote that story. And we're just adding image testing right now. What's interesting though, we thought that images would be an even stronger indicator for the success of the story, but that is not always the case. The headline itself, those 7 words, are as strong as the image itself. But now our editors run those in conjunction, sometimes testing only the image, sometimes only the headline. Sometimes they try out both a new image and headline at the same time, creating kind of mini multivariate tests.
And back to kind of this idea of kind of profitability, I'm thinking that there's been this big move into sponsored content or advertorials or native advertising within the past year or so. BuzzFeed and The Atlantic has tried it. I'm wondering whether in the future you might be doing, as the predictive analytics platform, predicting what kind of sponsored content may stick, or are you going to do anything around sponsored content? Or?
So on March 6th, 5:03 Eastern Standard Time, my company got acquired. But no, who's keeping a record of that? We spent 1,156 days on it. But all that said, it was actually acquired by a content marketing company, the biggest in the US, who helps the CNN, the Gnats, and the Cox, and the likes do content discovery below their articles. So you might read a story on CNN, and for some reason they might not have enough content themselves on a specific sports event, and they fill that up from by somebody else. And you see Forbes and The Atlantic do this already. I think it's very fair to assume that at some point we'll be making recommendations, if asked by the editors that we work for, on outside content. There might actually just be something around the Super Bowl that Derek simply doesn't have in his catalog. And he might just say, if I'm going to promote that story, why not make $10 on it at the same time? Because I can't ignore it in my sports module further down the page. So you'll certainly see us, well-marked, end up suggesting that as well.
Very briefly, because I think we're about to run out of time, what will the digital newsroom look like in 10 years' time? Will we all be laughing at the fact that we got obsessed about traffic or social? Or in terms of data, what will it look like? Very briefly.
I think consumers are being empowered more and more every day. I think the personalization question's a really valid one. I think you're going to see a lot of feedback coming in, thematic areas that are going to really dictate what you're doing with live programming, like we do at Weather, and a lot of live news programming, what I call content that's very perishable. But I also think it's going to predict long form. And my take is it's all about big data. What we're talking about here is, how the platforms that are out there like now, Facebook, Twitter, and there's probably 30 or 40 of them right now with, millions and millions of users. They're all going to be just another way we go to market. And I do believe that the data that we get back is going to make us more intelligent, and companies across all industries, and weather being one of those data sets naturally, audience being one of those data sets, context being one of those data sets, and other data sets that come. I really believe that if companies do not understand how to use big data, get insights and intelligence from it, they will struggle. And I said this back in the late 90s with e-commerce when retailers said, no, if we put up an e-commerce site, let's date myself here, if we put up an e-commerce site, it's going to stop store traffic. It's going to inhibit, it's going to hurt our store traffic. And really what ended up happening, it was just another channel for them to sell. Stores didn't go away, but there was this hybrid model, and I think you have something like that happening in the newsroom.
So I'm going to limit the others to 140 characters, just so that we stick to time. Jack, can you do it?
I spend a long time on my tweets, so I'm not sure I can do that. I think a couple of years we'll drop the word social from social media. I think probably a few years after that we'll just start to see that the brands exist as platforms rather than as totally coherent commercial entities. Probably, I imagine what you heard earlier about the Forbes model is probably quite an interesting way that it might go. Or it'll all be paid content and everything will be behind paywall.
Derek?
I think in a decade's year time, if we're not paid content, we're not going to be here. So I think over the next 10 years, last year, sorry, I'm over 140 characters here, but you know, there's something like 450 newspapers in America last year went behind some sort of paid model of varying degrees, and I think you're going to see a lot of that in the next couple of years in Britain. The industry cannot sustain, certainly with the sizes of newsrooms we have, and the level of journalism we're producing, giving that content away for free. There's a brand extension argument where you can make the journalism be paid for from elsewhere, but I think ultimately we're going to go back to the traditional newspaper model, which is we're going to sell our news.
Very briefly?
I think we're going to see things disconnect just a little bit. So if you're the Connecticut Post today, you figure out the demands and you own the production and you have the responsibility of the promotion of that content. I think the demand is going to fall back into the hands of the consumers or readers, and they'll own that part. I think some of the media companies we know today, they will own the production of content, and some of that will fall into what we might describe as amateurs. Look at the Forbes module to some extent. And then I think the promotional parts will be like we see in TV, cable-like companies that own that responsibility of distributing the content that's been produced here. So I think those three parts will get disconnected and not just lie within single organizations that might not be experts in all of them.
Fantastic. So it's now afternoon coffee break, but before we do that, please thank the four lovely panelists.